Ashley Frawley is the author of the Semiotics of Happiness and a university lecturer at Swansea and a reader for Zero Books. And she is a returning guest this week. It is Sunday, December 8th, 2019, and I'm Douglas Lane, the host of this podcast and the publisher of Zero Books. This week's podcast is free to everyone, but next week we're going to be going back to a schedule where you get 2 podcasts a week if you're supporting us on Patreon and 1 podcast a week on the main feed. We just started Critical Theory Streams YouTube channel. That's also where our podcasts and video streams will go. This particular podcast was recorded as a stream as well. So if you want to watch this interview, you can look for it on YouTube. So enough of that. Here's Ashley Frawley and I discussing humanism in the age of Trump. I'm going to call it that. Humanism in the age of Trump.
Hi, so I'm Ashley Frawley, and I'm one of the readers for Zero Books, and I'm the author of Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem, and the forthcoming Significant Emotions, Rhetoric and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age. And I am a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University.
Great. And so your first book was called The Semiotics of Happiness. You just mentioned that, and it examined how the question of personal happiness was transformed into a social and political problem, and what the implications of that were, and what the impact on people's lives from that was. Your next book, which you mentioned, Significant Emotions, looks at the emotional turn in public discourse and at how, quote, emotions have become key signifiers of a broader cultural tendency to affirm conservative politics over progressive politics, or conservatism over progressivism, over progress, maybe even would be a better way to put it without attaching it to a particular political ideology. So how did this emotional turn take place from your perspective as a sociologist, and why was it conservative?
Okay, so how the emotional turn took place is sort of a multi-layered question. There's lots of sort of angles that you can look at it from. So on the one hand, there's a more recent turn toward emotion, which is associated with therapy culture, which is this sort of cultural turn that happens really in the 60s in response to the sort of loss of transformative politics. So after the Second World War, there was this real sense that, large-scale social change led by human beings was a defunct and dangerous project. And there was a real turn inward after that point. But of course, the precursors to that turn inward predate the Second World War. So you have like Freud. There's a very good documentary that I'm sure lots of people have watched by Adam Curtis, or a series of documentaries called The Century of the Self. And he explains very well this sort of century-long turn toward the self. And that kind of happens within this context where we've kind of lost transformative politics, but also lost a sense of tradition and belonging to the past and therefore to the future. So there's this, and I'm not like mourning that, but what happens is you lose this kind of script that tradition used to give you to live your life. And you kind of have to select everything for yourself. And that freedom occurs at a time where there's very little faith in the human subject to be able to actually handle those kinds of decisions. But also this turn towards seeing a huge range of social problems, not rooted in social structures or, capitalism or something like that, but rather rooted in human behavior. And so every choice that you make suddenly becomes pregnant with meaning, and they're not sort of incidental choices. They become choices that reflect who you are, your identity, your relationship to the world, social problems, and so on. So an example of that would be like, being a parent as this sort of incidental kind of banal thing that all human beings more or less have done, not all, but most human beings have engaged in throughout human history, starts to become parenting, this active kind of role that is associated with social problems, so whatever parents do becomes associated with everything that a person becomes later in life, and it becomes associated with a huge range of social issues. So then even this sort of like what used to be this banal choice between like, would I feed from my breast or would I feed with formula milk becomes like this existential crisis. So all of this sort of happens, and it becomes the sort of backdrop into which this almost obsessive regard for human subjectivity and human emotion kind of emerges. But I think this tendency to see human beings as the center of most social issues goes back quite far. And the difference today is that there's nothing to rise up against it. So, for instance, I remember when I was doing my PhD, I was going through, I was looking for this quote that I remembered reading, but I couldn't remember where it was in Marx, where he says something about Malthus. So I was going through like everything I ever read from Marx, looking for Malthus. And it was funny because I couldn't find a single time where he mentions Thomas Malthus without insulting him in some way.
Yeah.
He like this sort of like anti-human kind of person who sees human beings as like plague on the planet, sees human inequalities between human beings as like just the state of nature and ever it shall be. It had this kind of fierce opposition. But what's happening now is that there's nothing to oppose that. This idea that ultimately it's human behaviors and human subjectivity and human nature that explains every social issue is just widespread, and it's just crossed the political spectrum, and there's really no one left to stand up for human beings. And so part of that is this turn toward emotion, which sees emotions as the solutions to all social problems, because it's sort of like through these disordered emotions like greed or whatever, you have bad behaviors, which then lead to social problems, right? So then if you want to solve problems, you have to go into people's minds and change the way that they think instead of looking out into society. We become more and more convinced that ultimately it's us that are to blame. And what's interesting is that used to be something that was associated with quite right-wing movements. So I find like in my second book, I go through and I use the example of Vilfredo Pareto. And he's an interesting character because you can see that at the beginning of his work, he's famous for like coming up with this idea, not coming up with, but contributing to the idea that capitalism works in equilibrium. And so there's this wonderful system that works perfectly on paper. And then when he looks out into the world, it doesn't work. And he's this wonderful system, and you people keep fucking it up. Right. And he becomes more and more obsessed with what he calls sociology, but it's really like basically studies in defective human nature. He becomes more and more obsessed with sociology and psychology as he moves through his life. And I think Pareto is like a metaphor for our culture today, where like we looked out into the world. He had like, the Enlightenment would have these wonderful ideals of rationality, freedom, equality, brotherhood. And when people looked out into the world, they saw what appeared to be unreason, irrationality, war, inequality. And instead of looking as Marx did, he said, look, if you want to have these things, you need to actually push past. These are all real good stuff. But if you want that to be real, you need to push past this particular system. Instead, they saw this system as the be-all and the end-all, and if it didn't work, then it must be something wrong with us. And so instead of jettisoning their models, they jettison the human subject. I think that's kind of what's happened, and that's where we are right now. That opposition is gone. We're kind of just left with this, across the political spectrum, this consensus that ultimately it's human beings that lie at the heart of all social problems. And so emotional discourses come into that as part of that understanding that it's our inability to manage our emotions and thus our behaviors that explains everything.
Well, there's a lot there to unpack. One thing that I was thinking about before we started the conversation was about how when we tried to have this conversation before, the way I was framing it was around attacks on the human subject, around denial of the significance of human subjectivity, or desire to escape from our own responsibility as subjects. But one thing that has come to my attention in the last couple of days is I've been thinking about Christopher Lasch and Hegel for this video that I'm writing and producing, is that the embrace of the self, the human subject as a self, can be attached to a desire to return to tradition of one kind or another, or to develop a new kind of tradition, which I'm more sympathetic towards. And Lasch is one of these thinkers in the late 20th century who really it has become conservative towards the end of his life, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he really is concerned about the human subject, but he's concerned about the human subject in psychological terms. He's concerned about the narcissism of the human subject today. He's concerned about the lack of emotional and psychological support from a modern world that's plagued by the disease of progress. He writes a book against progress. And it seems to me that there's kind of a different approach to the human subject, which is one where you embrace the fact that the subject changes, that is different from the kinds of attempts to embrace the human subject that might be related to or associated with traditional humanism, where you're trying to embrace a kind of self which has the characteristics of being rational and reasonable and a good citizen and all of that, and which is then fixed. That there's something about human subjectivity which implies change. So I feel as though one way to think about this is not just in terms of the human subject, but the subject as an agent of change, the subject as attached to progress, the subject as a temporal being. So I don't know. I'll let you respond to that if you have any responses to that.
I don't know. It sounds like me talking. Like, yeah, absolutely. What I find kind of disturbing is that at a certain point you read so much over your life, and then you don't know where your own ideas end and someone else's begin. So I had this whole idea that the open subject, so considering subjectivity as open, as undetermined, is really, really important and really crucial, and something that I fear is being forgotten by progressive movements. We're sort of moving toward this kind of deterministic understanding of the subject, which is useful for claims to get attention to particular injustices, to say that this injustice damages you in some way. But when you do that, you kind of let go of this idea of the self-determining kind of subject, the subject that is much more open and isn't, we let go of this idea that human beings will react differently in different circumstances. So having an open idea of what it means to be human is incredibly important, because it means an open future. Because one of the things that people will often launch against any kind of progressive movement or Marxism is like, oh, but human nature. So it's quite important, politically, to have this idea, but also it's just empirically, when you look throughout history and around the world, human beings respond extraordinarily differently to all sorts of different circumstances. It's astonishing the different ways that human beings have lived their lives. And it's just an empirical kind of observation that subjectivity is incredibly open. So an open subject means an open future. And I think that's really important. The human beings can be rational or irrational. You can emphasize emotion, or you can emphasize rationality, that both vulnerability and resilience equally describe the human experience. And the question is, which side do you default to? Which side do you champion? And I think what's happened is that this recognition that human beings can be vulnerable has led to this kind of reification of vulnerability and this dismissal of rationality, and the sort of more rational Enlightenment subject is sort of dismissed as a myth through the back door, right? So the Enlightenment subject was seen as this social construction, but the emotional, vulnerable subject is not seen as a social construction. That's the truth.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. The question that came to mind when I was looking at your book and its description, the book is called Significant Emotions. What's the subtitle to the book again?
I changed it, which is why I always forget what it is. It's Rhetoric and Social Problems in a Vulnerable Age.
Right. Okay. But what struck me was that I didn't really know what the word emotion meant in the context of your book. I mean, I know obviously I'm not Spock or I'm from this planet, so I know what an emotion is. I've had them. I think I may be having one right now. But when I thought about what was an emotion in the social context, I wasn't sure. And so I kind of did a little Googling and thought, I Googled the question, what is an emotion? And I found this article in The Guardian that said that when you really press psychologists, it was actually started out talking about this Disney movie, Inside Out. You see that movie?
Yeah. I actually wrote something about that. Apparently my analysis was crap because it didn't get published. It's one of the only things I've ever written that didn't get published.
But what the psychologist was saying was that when you ask psychologists what an emotion is, if they have a couple drinks anyway, they'll admit they have no idea. That really, when you strip away sensation, like bodily sensation, and desire, or the passions from the question, and then you strip away thinking or interpretation, you don't have anything left. Mm-hmm. We start to think about emotions. We think they're these concrete experiences, but in fact, emotions are a combination of physical sensation and interpretation to create a meaning.
Yeah, there's all sorts, and there's like affect as well. I'm not actually really. Sorry, go on. You were gonna.
No, I want you to. I gave you the screen so what's the difference between an affect and an emotion?
Well, for me, it's not all that important. So like right. A lot of what I talk about in the book, so I talk about self-esteem as well, happiness, well-being, mental health. And I'm not like talking about like what do you really feel? And I'm interested in how people talk about the inner world of human beings, about the relationship between reason and emotion. And for me, emotion or affect or anything is how people use that language in the public sphere. So I'm not all that interested in how people actually feel, although I think that's very interesting, and there is, for some people, and there's a lot of research in that area. For me, I'm interested in how human beings are talked about and invited to think about themselves, just invited to think about themselves, and how particular discussions of people's inner sort of non-rational world fits into broader narratives of social problems. So that's where my research is and what I'm interested in. It's about the language of emotion. And of course, if you were to get into it, you would get all sorts of into all sorts of debates about what self-esteem actually is, what happiness actually is, what mental health actually is. And there's all sorts of debate about that. And I'm interested in which of those definitions become powerful in the public sphere. They're not really talked about that much. It's sort of which is kind of interesting as well. Like particularly with happiness, it's always it's left to kind of float, and you have your own particular. That's why it's so you have your own particular understanding what it is, and people will kind of draw on that, even though they have their own definition, the one that's actually used in policy. But that's why it's so important to actually study how particular things are used in the public sphere. What a problem actually becomes when people talk about it, and when particular advocacy groups and lobby groups and so on sort of organize around a particular keyword, because people all have their own sorts of ideas. So that's kind of my issue when people see that I'm studying happiness, people often want to have like a philosophical conversation about what happiness is. And they'll go, oh, well, surely governments are just trying to do X. And I'm like, no, that's what you think when you hear the word happiness, and you kind of assume that that must be what governments are into. But you have to actually see how they actually talk about it, how they define it, how it fits into this world of social problems, and then you can truly understand what it becomes in a cultural sense. But people kind of, claims makers or lobby groups or advocates, basically rely on the fact that people have a different understanding in their own minds, that they rely on this kind of visceral connection that people have with that, like, oh, that can't possibly be bad. And that's basically the extent of it. That sounds pretty good. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to argue for mental ill health, and I'm not going to champion depression.
Everyone should be
right?
unhappy. Everyone should be unhappy.
And
everyone should be mentally ill. That's not the. That's not
so they kind of count on that. So you wanted to have a conversation about, like, I don't know, jobs or housing or something like that, and then they kind of wave their hands and they're like, "But you're really concerned about mental health," and you're like, I'm not concerned about mental health. Well, I am, aren't I? So you're kind of disarmed, right? So it becomes this this kind of disarming rhetoric. So that's what I study is how the language of emotion is used. And by emotion, I just mean like affective states, anything at all that is like this, the irrationality or the non-rational capacities of human beings. And also you would say like, oh, emotion's not totally irrational, right? But I'm talking about, I create this sort of dichotomy just as a way of like cordoning off how it's actually talked about in the public sphere. And how it is talked about in the public sphere is in this sort of binary sort of way, that we pay too much attention to reason, to rationality, and so on. And what we really need to do is focus on the side of human beings that is about feeling. Yeah. And so that's the kind of bit that I'm interested in.
And that's a thought stopper, because I've actually been in therapy before. I'll admit this on air. And when I was in therapy, the last time I remember being in therapy, I was young, and the therapist kept asking me how I felt, and I would always respond, "Well, I think X," and there's no, tell me how you feel. And I don't remember how that all got resolved. I imagine I said something like, I feel irritated with you, but the fact is that if I were to really only say what I felt, I would be reduced to saying, my palms are sweaty, or I have indigestion, or I feel elated and my body feels light, and whatever it would be, but it would not have any signification. It would just be kind of free-floating feelings, sensations, to talk about how you feel. But what they're really asking is not how you feel, but what do you assume? What are the interpretations that you're not examining that you then feel as just an emotion? Mm-hmm. Don't you think that's sort of what's going on when we take this emotional turn, is that people are being asked, what do you really feel? Well, that means, what do you think is true beyond question?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we've lost anchors beyond the self for truth. So, and that's been this kind of crisis that's existed in the West for, I don't know, I suppose since the Industrial Revolution, and since the Enlightenment, is we lost that sort of religious certainty. And there's been this kind of quest for moral certainty, but there's nothing really beyond the self to anchor that quest in. So we've kind of given up on the future. So, I mean, like for a Marxist, you think you keep your eyes on the progress of civilization, and you kind of see where we're going. And that is kind of your anchor for what you want, right? You kind of see, like, I kind of see you've got your finger on the pulse of history. That's a really bad metaphor, but you
try to find it. I think most Marxists today are pretty lost, but try to find it.
You're trying to find that, right? And you're trying to see kind of where things are heading, and make a judgment that could be really bad, or it could be really good, and you kind of hope it's going to go on the really good side. And you kind of want to do everything that you can to make sure that it falls down on that good side. So I think, like, for me, what led me to Marxism and to sort of identify as a Marxist was this. I realized suddenly the possibilities of human freedom that were being made available within capitalism. And then on the other side, so you see this like progressive force, and then you see the regressive force of pushing back, and you want to take the side that's pushing forward, and try to go there, try to follow that. What do we need to do to free these means of production, these forces that have this potential, this power to free human beings from toil, to create a new world and save it from the destructive side, which is like, crisis and people starving in a world of incredible wealth. And that's like that's kind of what you want to do, right? So for me, that's where the anchor is. And it's interesting because when I had that anchor for meaning beyond myself, I don't really think about my own feelings that much anymore, which is interesting because I definitely was. So I say this all the time. Like I grew up in this therapy culture, and this sense of meaninglessness and normlessness really spoke to me. When I first sort of studied sociology, this idea that we've lost all of these kinds of certainties. Absolutely. Growing up, I just wanted someone to tell me like, tell me who I'm supposed to be. Tell me how I'm supposed to act. Give me a rule book. I need like a rule book because there's no certainty left anymore. So I felt that anchor had been lifted, and I was sort of floating in a sea of uncertainty. And for me, that and then that led to like a lot of self-obsession, because that's what you get. The anchor for truth is in the self now in our culture. So how do you feel about that? And how are you feeling today? And I remember, I say this all the time, I tell this story all the time, but I remember like saying, like putting things up on my wall, like, don't save happiness up for the future, be happy now. Because like, that's what I thought the whole point was. And I was so miserable thinking about myself all the time.
Yeah.
It was awful. Now I just don't really think about my own feelings very much anymore, because I feel like I am involved in projects beyond myself. But I think that's really gone for most people. That I think, or at least we're kind of encouraged not to have any sense of a future or a meaning system beyond the self. More and more that's become, how I feel about it is kind of where truth has gone, because there's where am I supposed to draw for the ultimate authority? I can't say do this because God said so. And so what people do is they say, do this because it's good for your health. Do this because it's good for your mental health. And you see that all the time. Like I give one of the assignments in one of my classes is for students to take a news media item and sort of analyze it. And you just always see that the warrants for any kind of action around social problems are always like, because if we don't act, mental health will decline. If we don't act, kids will just get really fat. It's like right. If we don't act, like obesity is going to go through the roof, and this sort of, there's always something to do with health or mental health. Like increasingly, that is the warrant for action. Those are the values that people will draw upon, and so that's where truth is gone. So people aren't going to say like, do this because a political future, like my political project is going to bring a better future. It's do this because if you don't act, the citizens' health will worsen, people's mental health will worsen. So that's become the truth of the culture.
So how do you think it is that the left, which is supposed to be future oriented, and I feel as though in some ways, even now, the left really is still future oriented. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking back 20 years, but there was a peace movement after 9/11, and it had a future orientation of building a way to stop wars, to create a peaceful coexistence between nations. And that was its future orientation. And, you have even the anti-austerity movement, had a future orientation where people's basic needs would be met. And Marxism, of course, has its own future orientation towards socialism and freedom. But it seems like there's a aspect of the left, or there's a kind of a tendency on the left to embrace certain kinds of orientations around therapy culture. There's a big emphasis, or it comes and goes, but an emphasis on self-care and and then on things like affective labor, and the questions of feelings. Also a lot of even in our own imprint, people like Mark Fisher talking about capitalism primarily in terms of its emotional and psychological effect. I think this comes from a certain understanding of alienation out of Marx. So, but what do you think it is that is, well, to what extent do you think the left really is still holding on to a progressive vision or onto a vision of change? And do you feel as though the left is the source of this move towards significant emotions?
Well, it definitely didn't start on the left. This sort of move towards significant emotions, this like drawing out emotions as significant, as the significant thing around which we should all rally, didn't start on the left. It's very much associated with systems of social control. There's some mix-up intermingling with eugenics. It's got a really dirty past. I think what happened is we've lost a sense of totality. So there isn't any kind of coherent meaning system that we can all kind of share as a movement, which is really dangerous and disarming. So, for instance, there's an essay by Trotsky called "What is National Socialism?" I think, where he kind of makes fun of fascism, and it's like really clear how fascism is just aping the language of workers and leftism and taking the word socialist and he's got a coherent. He says he's just making fun of them, like they've got zoological materialism. And whereas we have, historical materialism, we have a clear understanding, we've got a clear economic understanding. It's not just like, ooh, bad rich guys, like it's a full-on analysis of what's wrong with the world. And that's gone now. That has been defeated. And what winds up happening is we can get pulled down these paths, and we don't realize that they're really regressive because they sound really nice. So the Nazis called themselves National Socialists, and it was really clear that they were not socialists. Now, I mean, if you read a lot of fascist texts, there's a lot of really scary shit in there that is pretty similar to stuff we hear now, but there isn't it sounds good, so we're kind of disarmed. We have nothing we're not clear about it. So actually, when we met in London a few weeks ago, I was sort of joking around saying like, it's hard to imagine any bad idea from the past that hasn't been rehashed or couldn't be rehashed, or any bad idea just generally that couldn't be rehashed through progressive language that sounds really nice and that people go, that sounds good, because we're just sort of floating around. Right. And if it sounds good, it must be, right? So like if left and right are defined by like nice people and mean people, then what do you have to critically analyze something, right? It's just, well, that sounds really good. And then I get called a right winger because I'm like, no, just because this thing sounds good does not mean that it is good. And I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that it's quite bad. But we go, but it sounds so nice. We're talking about victims here. So I remember I was talking to somebody who I think is a leftist, self-identifies as a leftist. And I was joking and I was saying, like, for example, cultural continuity is so important. It's really important that people are rooted in their cultures. And what's happening right now is we have whole African communities that are just totally uprooted. And we've got these communities because they've lost so much of their population. And then we've got people in the UK, for instance, who are really just cut off from their religions and their meaning systems and their roots and their families. And so it's so important that we have really strong programs in those African communities that really just help people to feel rooted in their homes. And it's so damaging that they want to come to the West because they feel like we have so much and they have so little, but really the real truth and richness is in their cultures. Sounds really good, right? That is basically saying
That sounds almost vaguely. I mean, obviously, I'm not with you.
Literally, that is policy. That is like the thrust of a lot of international policy, like a lot of EU programs that try to like pay some black celebrities to go back to their villages and convince people to stay there.
Yeah, right.
And it's just a really progressive way of saying black people go home. Like, we don't want your type of immigration. But
Oh.
you can put it through this wonderful sounding language. And I was like, and this,
Mhm.
this person I was talking to was like, yeah. And I was like, I'm joking. This
Right. Well, the one
like,
thing
I'm
I
trying
would
to
say
think
is
of
that
like a woke way of saying like really racist things. Or like
here's a right-wing
been,
thing that's actually left-wing. We need to work on developing economically and technologically developing the whole world so that people don't have to leave their homes and they have a good life that they can build in their own communities. That sounds right-wing, doesn't it?
yeah. Well, and also it's not just that so people will stay in their homes and not be
No, but I
uprooted
mean, there's an
because
irrationality to everyone moving to the same place. That's all.
no, and everybody's not moving to the same place for
Right.
one thing. That's like
Right. But I mean, if
it's
you're
not
worried
like
about
affordable
everyone
movements
going,
or something like
you're worried about immigration, I think ultimately it comes down to let's spread people around so that things make more rational sense. You know, we have a limited amount of space and people should be moved around so that they're not all trying to cram into one spot because that's all. But I'm not saying anything about people coming to the West or not coming to the West or, I want total mobility and I want everywhere to be developed enough so that people can build lives wherever they want to end up.
wherever people want to go,
Yeah.
wherever they want to fall in love and be with their families and travel the world, that all of that stuff is really good. To be like forced to do that sort of thing, like people are not sitting and going into shipping containers that are like and freezing to death because they like think it's going to be a real fun time.
It's not the same as me going to visit London. It's all right. That
But
was wrong.
also having borders and that sort of thing forces people into those terrible situations. But the thing is that all of these things are kind of epiphenomena as well. It's like if you want to talk about immigration and you want to say like, oh, I'm pro-immigration, it's not that you want like more people to flee their homelands and that kind of thing. It's more of understanding that the sort of global flows of people and labor, and that these things will happen anyway, regardless of what your policy is. You close the borders, and people will just come through dangerous terrain, and that is exactly what's happening at the moment because the push and the pull is too strong, and there's nothing that you can really do to go back into people's villages and say, "Ooh, you should really just enjoy your life here," because if you can't feed your kids, you're going to go. And most people in that situation, if you actually hear people's situations, you would do the same thing. You would do the exact same thing.
Of course. Yeah.
But what's happening is like this complete lack of understanding, this complete lack of a full kind of, and there's, by the way, when I say complete lack, I just mean like in the public sphere, because there are people who do understand this and who do really good work. But just in this sort of general kind of, if you look at mainstream politics, if you look at mainstream discourse, you don't really see that very much. You see these kind of like surface level kind of discussions of, oh, it's so sad when you don't have this, when people leave their villages, and it's so sad when people don't have cultural continuity, and sort of missing this bigger picture kind of understanding. And that's what you get from having a totality, from having a totalizing understanding of how things work. And it's hard. It's really, really difficult to understand all of this and how it all fits together in a deep kind of economic context of why the whole world is not developed, why modernization failed. All of that's tough. It's easier. It fits into a soundbite to kind of say very simple things and to give personalized kinds of stories.
Yeah, that's for sure. People really like the personal stories. That seems to it's relatable when you do that. But
don't get me wrong. Like, okay, I say all this, right? But I now have somebody who does my social media for me, which if you're wondering why I've turned insane on Twitter, that would be why.
It's not you. It's just an insane person.
And I've studied how people simplify messages and get people on side for a long time, and I never thought I'd really play that game. But I'm starting to realize now that if you are obsessed with having a perfectly nuanced, exactly correct, like argument. It's not going to fit into a headline, and then no one's going to read your perfectly nuanced, coherent
Right.
argument. And so I'm starting to realize that's part of the reason why sociologists have kind of lost the sociological imagination never really made any headway, whereas what I call the psychological imagination has become really powerful now. They don't mind saying you and your, whereas I'm like, many people, not all people,
Right.
And a psychologist is like, you and your blah blah blah, and everyone goes, yeah, okay, I'm listening, you got me.
Yeah,
So
you're talking to me.
But at the same time, what happened is that is all that's left, right? So it's all that's left is the soundbite, and there's just kind of nothing there. We're all just sort of floating around. There, you got to find a way. Like I'm 100% for left populism. You have to find a way to talk to people, to convince people, and we're in simple messages, and I don't mean that in the way that people are just too stupid to understand. I mean just to get people's attention, because you're competing with loads of others. So this sort of cacophony of voices of other people who are saying, no, pay attention to my issue. It's the most important thing. And if you're sitting there going, well, you can kind of pay attention if you want, but it's really quite complicated, and it's this conversation that I'm just having with these 5 people over here. You're never going to win that kind of debate. So to get people's attention, to kind of win people over to your side, you do have to have both. You have to have a deep analysis, and you have to be able to speak to people and to get people over to your side at first.
Yeah. Look, and I think that's really important. Being clear, simple and clear, as simple and as clear as you possibly can be, should be the aim. And I know, like, in the critical theory tradition, it has become mired down in nuance to the degree that often enough you've seen it too, I'm sure. I mean, I know you have, because we've been reading the same books, that people will write in such a way as to not be understood in order to cover up.
What I learned too is that through having that person who does that, who's been helping me with Twitter, I'll talk to him and I'll be like explaining something, and then he will repeat it back to me in a really clear way. He says, so what you're really saying, because he's a journalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you're really saying is this. And it's literally the first time that I realized that what I'm really saying is that.
Right.
And I feel like that kind of academic language is a form of self-deception. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of self-deception, because you don't want to just come out and say what you really think, and so you hide it behind like layers and layers of nonsense. And so somebody needs like a PhD to understand what you're saying. And I feel like if someone can just pick up your book and read what it says and understand it, you kind of have to wonder what you're doing.
If people can't do that.
You said, yeah, if they can't do that, if they can't just pick up a book and read it. But you said once in one of your podcasts, or maybe it was just on Facebook, I'm not sure, you said that part of this obscure language that started to emerge was in the post-war period in critical theory, was to mask a conservative turn.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's what happened, is that if you just sort of came out and said what you were really saying, you might be a bit embarrassed of yourself. And I feel like even maybe the people who were saying these things didn't realize what they were really saying.
Right. I think this is what happens when people on the left embrace someone like Heidegger. It's like, why are they embracing Heidegger? Is it because he has some radical vision? No, it's a combination of they're environmentally concerned, and Heidegger gives them the feeling of being intelligent or something. That's
I feel like, I hate to say this, I feel like Hegel is, when you read anything and you understand anything that Hegel's writing, it's very similar. Yeah.
No, that's for sure.
The difference is that he's was kind of right, just upside down, right? So.
Right. I like Hegel a lot. One of the things about Hegel, though, I feel like is the trick with him is to take things more literally than you initially want to. Like when anyway, we won't go into that, but because I've been reading The Science of Logic, and we can talk about that on our own time or in a different podcast. But just to go back to emotions and the problem of the emotion, basically the therapeutic turn, the turn towards emotions being so dominant in our politics. Do you feel as though this has encumbered our reaction to, like, let's say, the passage of Brexit or the election of Trump or even events in like Bolivia or Chile or the Yellow Jacket movement. I mean, are we just unable to think through moments because we are so turned inwards on ourselves?
No, I mean, it's I can only say what people are being invited to believe. I don't know what people actually believe or how they think or how turned into themselves are and people are. And in fact, I'm continuously amazed by how, in spite of very strong invitations to conceive of ourselves as ill and as vulnerable and so on, how many people don't accept that invitation. So I don't think I wouldn't like put really I'm putting out counterclaims to that kind of whole narrative where I'm saying don't accept that invitation. It's not the only one possible. And that there's a whole other way of conceiving of human beings. And I'm begging people for a deeper economic analysis. So I don't necessarily think it's that is causing us to be held back. But I find that I'm continuously coming up against it, so much so that in the public sphere, any kind of movement is obsessed with that. So I do think that yeah, I mean, it holds back social movements, if not everyday people, because there's just nothing else on offer. And I just want to create a movement in which there's something else on offer. A much more open understanding of human subjectivity. Oh, by the way, I started saying earlier that I have lost where my own ideas start and others begin. So I had this idea of like the open subject means an open future. And I was like, well, that's a very good way of putting it, And then I was reading Marshall Berman's All That Solid Melts into Air, which I read like 10 years ago, I think. And damn it, it's right in there. That's where I got it. So it's a really good book and I highly recommend people read it.
I think if after 10 years, it becomes your idea. I'm just going to say.
But it's such a good book. So I was rereading that. But I want that kind of movement where we have a much more open understanding. I think that understanding of subjectivity is really necessary to push back against those counter arguments, which say, no, there's no point in trying to change things because all that will happen is human beings will mess it up again because it's something within us, in our human nature, that's causing that. But also there's this degeneration. So I said it's important to think about things in a totality. And the reason why I like Marxism is because it is a totalizing discourse. And what's happened is there's been this degeneration of movements into single issues. So you mentioned about the war, like Stop the War movement. And so when you're sort of focused on these single issues, we're all just sort of competing against each other for attention. And then that leads to even more apocalyptic claims making because you're trying to get people's attention. And how do you do that? You say, but mine is the biggest problem. You start out with like 1 in 20 people are affected, 1 in 4, 1 in 2, and then what winds up happening is people open the newspapers and they're like, oh my God, the whole world's going to hell. And so with that degeneration of campaigns into single issues, we've lost this kind of more positive kind of future-oriented discourse that excites people not through scaring the shit out of them, but through saying, look, the future can be much better than today, and that's worth fighting for. And also when a part of this degeneration into single issues and this loss of totalizing narratives, this loss of a deeper understanding of why things go wrong, the rise of putting human behavior as the source of social problems has become really powerful. And because these problems are not rooted in incorrect beliefs, incorrect emotions, incorrect behaviors, it actually is. The question for Marx was, why does rational logical behavior at the individual level create things at the aggregate that appear to be quite illogical, right? So that's right. Amazing about how he starts with that. But now for us, it's we start with defective psychology and we build up from there, right? And then the solutions to social problems are just get people's attention, tell them about the issue, make them change their behavior, and the problem will go away. Well, then the persistence of the problem then convinces people of the essential defectiveness of human nature, and they become more and more pessimistic. And you see this with the environmental movement. So this idea that it's just if enough people will just pay attention and change their behaviors, the problems will go away. And then it doesn't happen, because that's not why we have environmental problems.
Right.
And it just confirms for people even more the essential defectiveness of the human subject. And then it becomes very scary and misanthropic in a lot of quarters. A lot of parts of that movement have become very anti-human. And you can understand, because they're so frustrated. Like, why aren't you paying attention? Well, it's nothing to do with attention. It is embedded within the economic system.
Yeah. What you said earlier about everything breaking into fragments and us all struggling to get attention for our own little problem. And it's not just ours, but, like the anti-war movement has its problem. The anti-sexism movement, the feminist movement has its problem. The struggle against racism has its problem. And they're all competing for headlines and maybe government subsidies or NGO dollars or grants.
Yeah.
And
as well.
And so this makes me understand why when I say something like class has to be central, it is read as an attack on people who are more concerned about doing activist work around the environment or racial injustice or feminist work or protecting gays and lesbians. When I say class has to be central, they read that as these group of workers over here are the most important people.
Mm-hmm.
And our approach to dealing with class in a fragmented way, maybe, I don't know, the trade union movement needs all the dollars from NGOs or needs all the headlines from the newspapers, rather than, oh no, this issue is actually in all of the other ones.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. that and you can't just find it in the working, in the white working class, for God's sake, and you can't just find it even only in the workplace. But so anyway, that's just an observation, really. I'm not sure I'm giving you much to respond to there, but I'll let you try to respond if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, I always think if you want to know whether or not what you're doing is really radical and transformative, kind of look who whenever I'm pushing at a door and it swings open, I'm pushing at an open door, I always think is there something that I'm doing here that's not quite right? Like when people start agreeing with me, I'm like, oh crap, I got to rethink this.
Right.
I usually have to fight quite a lot to get people on side. And when I start saying something, people go, yeah. And I'm like, no, maybe I'm wrong. And I have to go.
Right.
But when you see that, you go, and I remember when I was a student, when I was doing my PhD, we occupied the Senate at Kent. And I just remember how pandering the university management was. They were like, oh yeah, tell us more. They were there with us and so on. Or when you see there was a big
okay, boomer, that's what I would have said.
Yeah. There's a big march in I think it was Toronto, and no, it must have been Ottawa. And then Justin Trudeau came out and was marching with the people, and people were like, who are we marching against? Or right. How much certain forms of gender and quote unquote race politics have become embraced by the powers that be, and how much they're pandering and just salivating at trying to put these things into policy. You just kind of have to wonder is what I'm doing here really all that powerful? And somebody posted recently, I spend too much time on social media, I'm realizing. Somebody posted recently a video from I think I've lost you.
No, I'm still here.
Oh no, okay. Somebody posted a video recently of a Black Panther meeting. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, the whole very famous story of the ambush where they shot the Black Panthers and in their beds and so on. But what was so powerful about that particular meeting and that speech was he was saying, don't let them separate you. Don't let them think that it's whites against blacks, And I just think that was a very dangerous movement. And you want to know how dangerous it was? They shot the dude in his bed. Like,
right.
So like compare that, and I'm afraid of saying this sort of thing, like supporting Black Panthers or something like that.
Right.
But I mean, like how powerful that united working class kind of rhetoric is. It was
Right.
like immediately shut down. Whereas the kind of rhetoric that we have today, which is like so divisive, we're all bickering amongst each other, and it's so successful at just dividing people, and it's so messed up, so that you've got like poor white working class people who are supposedly oppressing other people within the working class. You can see how regressive that can be, and it's just absolutely championed.